All right, we're live with our newest episode of We the Individuals Live, where we believe in the novel proposal that we each choose our own manner of being governed. With me, as usual, is, of course, the founder and owner of We the Individuals, Jeff Peterson, and, of course, our fellow admin, Blaine Kelly. And tonight we are very excited to have with us Dr. Walter Block. Most of us in the libertarian community are already familiar with him, but if you are not, he, of course, is a professor at Loyola University. I had trouble pronouncing that earlier, so I've practiced it many times. Loyola in New Orleans. Dr. Block is very, very well known for his defense of the undefendable and is, of course, a heavily, heavily published writer, both academically, and you publish in a lot of different libertarian magazines and online articles. I think something around 500 articles. Is that correct, Dr. Block?
That is, yes.
Very, very impressive. Okay, before we even get started, I'm gonna tell you, I've never been to the Mises University, but I follow Tom Woods. I told you before the show, I'm a history guy more than an economics guy, so of course I love Tom Woods. And I remember him posting about one of the Mises University traditions between you and him, where you always get together and play chess, and I am a huge, huge fan of chess. I learned how to play when I was like 3 years old, and the primary reason now I want to go to Mises University is to find one of the two of you and play a game of chess against you. And so I'm bringing this up publicly so that I have to obligate you. Now you can't turn me down. I'm just going to whip out my chessboard, and we're going to have to play a game of chess, and I'm looking forward to the day that I get to do that.
Absolutely. All right. I take up your challenge.
Wonderful. If I can beat Dr. Block, I'm going to have bragging rights for the rest of my life. That's the way I look at it. All right, so tonight we are really wanting to talk about Austrian economics specifically. We talk about a lot of libertarian topics. We've talked about voting, and you would be a wonderful guest for all these. I think your names come up in previous shows, but we really want to focus on your professional field, and that's Austrian economics. I'm particularly interested in this because I'm not much of an economics guy, so I'm really hoping you can help me out tonight. The first question, just to start off, is why should we choose Austrian economics over neoclassical economics?
Well, I guess the short answer is because it's more nearly correct. It's
okay. Why is that?
Let me first say that Austrian economics, for those who are unfamiliar with this, has nothing to do with the economics of the country Austria, any more than Chicago economics has to do with the economics of the city Chicago. The reason they call it Chicago economics is because the people that started it, Simon and Friedman and Stigler and Becker, who are associated with it, just happened to be at the University of Chicago. Well, similarly, the people who started Austrian economics all lived in Austria. That would be Menger, Baum-Bawerk, Mises, Hayek. By the way, I once beat Hayek in chess, so it would be only fitting if you beat me in chess. Not that I'm any Hayek.
I'm not holding my breath, but it's a dream.
Not that I'm any Hayek, but I am older than you, and he was a bit older than me. Okay, so what is Austrian economics? And how does it differ from the mainstream? Well, it differs from the mainstream in one very important way, mainly methodological. For the for the Chicago or the Keynesian or the mainstream economics, economics is a system of hypotheses. There are no laws. There are only hypotheses. It's really an empirical science. And all of the findings of economics are tentative based on the next experiment or based on the next econometric regression equation, which is a way of manipulating statistics. Whereas for Austrian economics, there are, yes, vast reaches of economics that are just like that. For example, if we want to know what the price elasticity of bananas is, there's no law about it. We just have to go out and sniff. We have to go out and do empirical research. Or if you want to find out if we have a 10% tax on gasoline, how much less gasoline will be used, well, there's no theoretical necessary conclusion to that, and again, you have to do empirical research. So we Austrians agree with them, bar mainstreamers, that a lot of economics is as they say, all of it is empirical hypotheses or empirical generalizations. However, where the Austrians disagree with the mainstream is that we say that there are some things in economics, and I'm not putting any quantity on this, that are apodictic, necessarily true, and yet have something to do with the real world. See, the way these people think, they think that they're logical positivists. They're positivists. They think that if something is necessarily true, it's just a tautology and has nothing to do with the real world. For example, 2 + 2 is 4, or bachelors or unmarried men. On the other hand, if it has something to do with the real world, it can't be necessarily true. Whereas we Austrians believe in a thing called the synthetic a priori, namely something that is necessarily absolutely true and undeniable, and yet tells us something about the real world. Not everything, but something. So let me give you a few examples. I'm now going to trade you this pen of mine for your wristwatch. Or maybe a better example, your shoelaces. The value of your shoelaces are roughly the value of this pen. Okay, so we're going to make this trade, and I say it's necessarily and undeniably true that I value your shoelaces more than the pen, and you value the pen more than the shoelaces. Otherwise, we wouldn't make the trade. Now, I don't know what's in your head. Maybe you think I'll give you an A in my course if you make the trade, and you're not in my course, so that's silly. All I say is that there's something about this pen that you like more than your shoelaces, and there's something about your shoelaces that I like more than than my pen, and therefore, so that's one claim. Another claim is that we both gain in the ex ante sense of anticipations. Now, later on after the trade, one or both of us might not gain in the ex post sense, and namely we might regret the trade. But in the ex ante sense, we necessarily both benefit from it. So this here is one example, and I gave this example to Brian Kaplan. We had a debate on this. He's a neoclassical economist, a very good libertarian, but not an Austrian. And he just tried to wiggle out of that, and I don't think he was successful in wiggling out of that. I think that this tells us something about the real world, namely that trade, free trade, voluntary trade between consenting adults makes both traders, both people who engage in this exchange better off, and that this is undeniable. Let me give you another example. The minimum wage law will, if people are profit-seeking, the minimum wage law, say at $5 an hour, will unemploy everyone whose productivity is less than $5 an hour. So if my productivity is $2 an hour, and you want to make profits by hiring me, and you have to pay me $5, and I'm only worth $2, and you're going to lose $3, and you're profit maximizing, necessarily you're not going to hire me. And I think that this sheds light also on economic reality, and it's undeniably true. And you don't need to have empirical estimates of this. You don't have to do any econometric equations about it. But if you do, then this just illustrates it. Let me give you an example. Another example. In my PhD dissertation, I did it with Gary Becker, who was a very famous Nobel Prize-winning economist. And I was doing it on rent control, and my hypothesis was that rent control screws up housing in various ways, shortages and lousy housing, and you know the housing will fall into disrepair, and there'll be shortages, and vacancy rates will fall, and all sorts of bad things. And I had a system of regression equations, and most of the time my independent variable, namely amount of rent control in a city, my observations with the cities in the United States, most of the times the signs were correct, namely rent control was bad in various ways, and usually I got statistical significance at the 5% level. Every once in a while, rarely, I got the wrong sign, namely that rent control was good. And even more embarrassingly, every once in a rare while, I got statistically significant, horrible results. And when I did, now Gary Becker was too polite to say, block you moron, go out and do it again until you get it right. But he said something like that, and that's what he thought. So what was testing what? Was my stupid empirical regression equation is testing this apodictic economic law? No, it was just illustrating it, and so sometimes it failed to illustrate it. So if Becker really was a neoclassical, as he says he was, what he would have said is, oh, I got this genius block, my student, who's going to overturn everything we know about rent control, or he's going to make the claim that everything we know about rent control is only true 95% of the time or 99% of the time, but every once in a while rent control is very beneficial. But he didn't say that. He said, go out and do it again until you get it right, because we knew what was right. So what was testing what? As an Austrian, I say that I was trying to illustrate this law, and that this law is unimpeachable and undeniable. Okay, so that's one example where Austrianism diverges from the mainstream. Another one is in macroeconomics. And in macroeconomics, you have two versions of Keynesianism, the left-wing Keynesian and the right-wing Keynesian. The right-wing Keynesians of the Chicago school, like Milton Friedman. And what these Keynesians say is that the economy is unstable. It is always going to veer into either unemployment or inflation. And what we have to do, say the right-wing Keynesians or the Friedmanites, is use monetary policy. They were monetarists. The left-wing Keynesians, Samuelson and Keynes himself, were more fiscalists. We have to use, and Krugman is a left-wing Keynesian. You have to have tax and expenditure policies. But what they both agree is that the economy is unstable and it's going to veer off into unemployment or inflation. Whereas the Austrians say, no, 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 the reason we get unemployment or inflation is because of government interferences with the market. And one of our knockout blows or gotcha moments is, well, what about stagflation? Stagflation is you have unemployment and inflation, and now what are you guys supposed to do? If you put on the brakes, you'll have more unemployment, and if you put on the gas, you'll have more inflation, and you're sort of stuck. So I think the Austrian macro people are much more correct than the neoclassical. So now I've given two areas of disagreement, and I think that the Austrians are better at explaining and understanding the world, the economic world, which is the function of economics.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up the example with Becker, because that's something I actually heard from you once when I was actually taking an econometrics class. I was at one point an economics major, because we all make mistakes, before I switched to history, and it really got my wheels turning about Austrian versus classical economics, which I debated for a long time on which one was better. But what Jeff kind of was making fun of me for before the show was I still look at empirical evidence, but it's the history side of it. I reject econometrics. I agree with everything you say. I agree with everything that Austrians say, the statistical regressions. Even in that class I was told you always go back to theory when the signs are incorrect. But I look at history, and that is empirical evidence in a sense. Where does that fit into Austrian economics?
Well, look, let's take the history of what happened at the end of World War II, when North Korea and South Korea, on the one hand, and East Germany and West Germany was split apart, or rather Korea and Germany was split apart due to an accident of war. And these Koreans had the same culture, the same background, the same history, the same language, the same IQ, give or take. Everything was the same between North and South Korea. But everything was virtually the same, again, between East and West Germany. The only difference is that East Germany and North Korea went one way, namely communism, and West Germany and South Korea went another way, not pure laissez-faire capitalism, but something closer to free enterprise capitalism. Now, if all you have is history, if all you have is this empirical evidence that I just articulated, you might be tempted to say, well, this proves that communism doesn't work. And here we have evidence, 2 bits of evidence. But the commies could say, tut, 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 not so fast. The reason North Korea failed had nothing to do with communism. It was just that they had a lousy leader. And the reason East Germany failed had nothing to do with communism. They had a lousy leader. And I'll bet you they could then go on and say, if the guy who was the dictator of North Korea went to East Germany and the East German dictator went to North Korea, things would have been better. Namely, they have an alternative hypothesis. And we historians, or we people as historians, cannot say them nay. We can't say, oh, that's BS, or that's nonsense, or, that's silly. If all we have, I mean, someone once said history is just one damn thing after the other. I don't mean this as a deprecation of history. I mean, history is very important. We have to know what the empirical record is. But we need more than history if we're to find out why it is that communism is no good. And it can't be, well, you know, they tried it in North Korea, it didn't work. They tried it in East Germany, it didn't work. They tried it in Cuba, it didn't work. They're now trying in Venezuela, it didn't work. Because the opposition can always say, tut, 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 you know, there's some other explanation, the wrong dictator, or, you know, Castro should have been in Venezuela and Maduro should have been in Cuba, and then it would have worked better. And we can't say definitively, no, 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 you're talking through your hat. We need something like Hayek, who mentioned the information problems of communism, or Mises, who mentioned that you can't have any rational planning without prices. We need economics. So I'm not one to deprecate history. In its place, at the back of the bus, so to speak. I'm just kidding here. History is important, but if we want to find out why it is that communism doesn't work, or why it is that the minimum wage doesn't work, or why it is that rent control screws up, we can't just rely on history. I mean, what's his name? Krugman and Cardin Kruger are forever saying, you know, that the minimum wage, you know, there's some places they had a minimum wage, and it worked out fine. And all we can say is they didn't have ceteris paribus. They didn't have other things constant. And in the reality, you can never have controlled experiments. There's this joke in economics. It goes something like this. It says there's a physicist, a chemist, and an economist, and they're marooned on an island. And they have cans of food but no can opener. So the physicist says, let's drop the can from a certain height onto a rock of a certain hardness, and the can will open up and we'll be able to eat. And the chemist says, well, that's pretty good, but I can do better. Let's heat up the can with a certain pressure and temperature, and it'll open up and we'll have hot food. And they turn to the economist and they say, well, how can you help in our deliberations? And he says, assume a can opener. I mean, we have to make assumptions. We have to make ceteris paribus assumptions in economics because we don't have controlled experiments. Even North Korea and South Korea, East Germany and West Germany, Singapore versus Cuba are not controlled experiments. You can't control everything. In my class, I have an aisle down the middle of the classroom, and I can't say, well, look, prices are 20 cents for the people on the right side of the aisle and 10 cents on the left, and now we can deduce the differences. No. There were no controlled experiments in economics, and in order to do science, that is empirical science, you need controlled experiments. In science, you can do that. You can say, okay, we're putting this stuff in this test tube, and we're putting the same stuff in that test tube, and the test tubes are clean, and we're going to subject this test tube to this, but not that one, and now we infer that the difference came from the one thing that diverged. But we don't have that in economics. So as an Austrian economist, I say we need logic. Rather than, or certainly in addition to, the empirical evidence.
Okay, that's a good answer. I always try to keep Austrian economic theory in my mind when I'm looking at history, but there's always more studying to do. So hopefully in the future I'll have these answers at my own disposal. Jeff, I promised you earlier I was only going to ask one question before letting you ask yours. I lied. I asked two. I apologize, but let me get your word in here next. Jeff, I think your audio's not coming through. I'm gonna move on to some of the other questions I had until you get that fixed up, if that's all right, because I know you had some connectivity issues. So I will move on. Dr. Block, you mentioned Brian Kaplan earlier. I'm glad you brought him up because, of course, he has the infamous in Austrian circles article. You knew this was going to come up, I'm sure, because it comes up so often, about why he's not an Austrian economist. A lot of this stuff, I've read enough of the Austrian literature that a lot of it's just his critiques of indifference curves, easy to throw out if you read Man, Economy, and State. But there were some things that go, okay, I don't have an answer for that. One of the ones that I've never seen an answer to, I'm sure it's out there, but I haven't found it, is where he critiques Rothbard on value scales versus utility. And what he's accusing Rothbard of, as you know, is that Rothbard could not derive the income and substitution effect from his method of ordinally ranking values. He has to put the placeholder values in there mathematically to be able to do this. And again, I'm not an economics guy, so it's stuff that I have trouble wrapping my head around. But what's the Austrian response to this? Is Kaplan right?
Well, there are really two issues here. I think Austrians agree that there are income and substitution effects. The income elasticity would be if I double your money, are you going to double the amount of hot dogs you eat?
Right.
And probably not, because hot dogs are an inferior good, or peanut butter or spaghetti or things like that. You're going to probably less than double your increase of that, and you might even decrease it. It might be an inferior good, because now you're going to have steak or lobster because you're much richer. On the other hand, the substitution effect is that if I double the price of hot dogs, you're going to have fewer hot dogs, ceteris paribus, other things equal. So I think Austrians and mainstream people agree with income and substitution effects. Where the dispute arises, and I wish I had a blackboard here because you really need a blackboard to illustrate this, is a thing called the Giffen good, Giffen or IN or something like that, Giffen good. And this is the idea that you can have upward sloping demand curves because the income effect will outweigh the substitution effect. The idea here is, the usual example is the Irish potato situation. The Irish were very poor, and now let's say the price of the price of potatoes rises. Let's say the price of potatoes falls, so you think they would have more potatoes, but they have fewer because they were so poor. All they had was potatoes, and now they feel richer, so they don't have as many. And the income effect outweighs the substitution effect. My answer to that is that on a demand curve, an Austrian demand, you see, a neoclassical demand curve is got income embedded in it. And the idea here is that when prices fall of potatoes or hot dogs or cars or anything else, you're richer, other things equal. But what's supposed to happen on a demand curve is you're supposed to take away the income effect from that kind of a demand curve, because along the demand curve, the only thing that's supposed to be varying is price. And yet, if you include income in the demand curve, then something else is varying. Two things are varying. So this is sort of an illegitimate demand curve, or you don't have to call it illegitimate. Just say there are two kinds of demand curves. And on that kind of a demand curve, you could have a Giffen good, but on a demand curve that, strictly speaking, insists that only one thing vary, price and quantity, or as quantity moves, only one thing changes, well, then you can't have a Giffen good. But this is sort of a very, very esoteric thing, and without a piece of paper and a blackboard, I fear that this is going to be lost on most people unless they're really into economics. And
well, I'm really happy you brought that up, because I thought about asking you about Giffen goods and I didn't, but I never considered that answer. So I know that there was supposedly at least two Giffen goods discovered in 2007. Is that correct? And the way they did this was they gave like vouchers for certain commodities in these poor Asian countries. And so what you're saying is those vouchers essentially make it not a true demand curve. Is that what I'm understanding?
That's roughly what I'm saying. Well, I'm really saying there are two kinds of demand curves. One where you're strict to what a demand curve is supposed to mean, and the only thing that varies is price and quantity, not income. On the other hand, if you have the neoclassical demand curve where income is allowed to vary, well then, yeah, I guess you could have a Giffen good, but that doesn't mean that demand curves don't slope downward. Legitimate demand curves always slope downward necessarily. These illegitimate demand curves need not always slope downward, although as an empirical issue, 99% of them do, because the income effect doesn't outweigh the substitution effect.
Okay, well, I'm very glad that you answered that. I did have one other Brian Kaplan question, but Jeff, is your audio working now?
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
okay, good.
Okay.
Let me go to you because I don't want to step on your time.
Okay, I had a couple questions, but my first one is rather basic. It's going to be a little bit more basic than Chris's or probably Blaine's. Is that, if you know anything about Austrian economics, you'll know that Austrian economics is not prescriptive, it's descriptive. So I was wondering if you could elaborate that on a little bit, and also with that in mind, whenever I talk about Austrian economics, people actually, critics of it or people who don't know any better will say Austrian economics isn't used anywhere in the world. That being said, is that if you were in a position to make change, like Fed chairman or economic advisor, without just ending the state, what policies would you put into place based off based off your understanding of economics?
Well, you've asked about 3 or 4 questions
Oh, sorry.
once in there. That's okay. Let me try to break it down. There is such a thing distinguishing normative and positive economics. And as you quite correctly say, economics is descriptive, not prescriptive. Economics has got to do with positive economics, not normative economics. I had a very interesting experience on this. I was telling my intro classes this distinction between ought on the one hand and should on the one hand and is on the other hand. And this kid said, no, that's all wrong. And I try to say, give more examples. And, whenever some introductory student says I'm wrong, I try to give different examples. And finally he says, no, you're full of beans. He wasn't that impolite. And he said, my father agrees with me. My father said there's no distinction. And I said, wow, his father, I assume his father's a bright guy, and, maybe he's a doctor or an engineer, a physicist, something like that, and he's very smart, but he doesn't understand economics. It turns out this kid's father was a professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And me and his father then got into a whole bunch of letters back and forth on this issue. And finally what happened is I published them as a debate between me and this kid's father. So if anyone's interested in this, email me. I'm at wblock, W-B-L-O-C-K, at loyno.edu, L-O-Y-N-O, Louis, Oliver, Yellow, New Orleans.edu is an education. And I'll send you this debate that I had with this kid's father about normative and positive. Or if you have any other questions that I don't give full value to, please feel free to email me. Okay, so that's the first one. Is there a distinction between normative and positive? And yes. Let me give one example of that. Let's take the minimum wage. I think as a positive, descriptive thing, minimum wage will create unemployment for unskilled workers. Does that mean that as an Austrian economist I oppose the minimum wage? No, not necessarily. Look, I could be a mean guy. I could be vicious. I could be nasty as an Austrian economist, and I could say, I want unskilled workers to be unemployed, and therefore I favor the minimum wage. My understanding is that in the early days of the Austrian economics, some of them were Nazis. Well, you can't be a libertarian if you're a Nazi, but you can be a good economist just like you can be a good chemist. And I hope the New York Times won't interpret this as me being pro-Nazi here or anything like that. To say,
they do like taking you out of context. I've read
a little out of context if they think that I think Nazis are okay. I don't think Nazis are okay. I just think that they can be good chemists, good physicists, good economists. But nasty people. Okay, Jeff, what was the other question that we did?
If it was you're in a position of power, obviously, what would you do to improve the?
If I were in a position of power, or if I were Rand Paul's advisor, or I was Ron Paul's advisor, one of his economic advisors. As an Austrian economist, I would do nothing. Because as an Austrian economist, I'm limited to saying what causes what. And I could say the Fed screws up the works. The Fed is the planning bureau for money, and just as we know that central planning doesn't work based on Mises's book Socialism and Human Action, why should we think that planning would work for the monetary system? I mean, we all know that agricultural planning of the Soviet Union didn't work, and we know why. Well, it applies to this as well. But so as an Austrian, I would do absolutely nothing because I'm limited as an Austrian economist to just explaining what causes what. Now, as a libertarian, what I would do is I would get rid of the Fed. I wouldn't, monitor the Fed. I would just get rid of it, and I would. I was going to say I'd go on the gold standard, but. Strictly speaking, I would allow the free enterprise system to choose whatever money it wanted to intermediate trade. I mean, we have to have some sort of trade intermediation because of this thing called the double coincidence of wants. So, for example, if I have a chicken and I want a pickle, I have to find some guy who has pickles and wants a chicken. And the odds of that are pretty low. So what I'll do is I first turn my chicken into salt. or sugar or cement or whatever, and then assuming that most people use these things, I then buy a pickle with it. So I make 2 trades. Well, what should be the trade intermediation? Should it be salt or sugar or cement or bananas or gold? Well, for various reasons, whenever people were free to choose, they chose gold as the trade intermediary. So when I say I favor the gold standard, I'm really saying I favor free enterprise money. And if this time people pick platinum or silver or copper, that's fine, whatever people choose. Now, Milton Friedman had this free to choose series, a very famous series, which made a lot of good points, but he was against free market money. He wanted U.S. fiat currency. He wanted the Fed. So I think he was a little inconsistent there. So what I would do as a libertarian would be, well, I'm an anarchist, so I'd get rid of all the government, and I'd certainly get rid of the Fed to start with, because the Fed is one of the most important generators of economic malaise.
Okay. And for what it's worth, I do think Free to Choose is a wonderful series. I've watched all 10 episodes, but I agree with all the criticisms of Milton Friedman. Still a fan of the guy, but you got to pick and choose what to agree with him about, because he was wrong on some things. Blaine, I told you I was going to come back to some more questions after Jeff's, but because I had a few extras at the beginning, I want to go to you. We saved Blaine for left. Blaine's actually our economics student here, our formal economics student, and he has, I think, some of the more technical questions for you, so we wanted to make sure those were at the end, but definitely interested in them. What you got, Blaine?
Well, they were supposed to be, but Dr. Block, you've already blown a few of them out of the water.
Okay.
I was going to bring up Giffen goods and statistical analysis and economics.
Well, that's good. That's good. What else you got?
Yeah, but barring that, I was going to ask, how do Austrians approach so-called public goods differently than the standard neoclassical approach?
Well, public goods are part of the, what do you call it, market failure. Mm-hmm. Another difference between Austrians and mainstream is market failure. And the main market failure is, I guess, monopoly. And another big market failures, externalities, and I think you've picked the third most important, in my hierarchy anyway, public goods. And there are many, many other market failures, so-called. That's a very good distinction between Austrians and mainstreamers, because Austrians don't think that there are any market failures. Now, this doesn't mean that we think people are perfect, that there's no losses. There are profits and losses, so people make mistakes. But that's not what market failure means. What market failure means is some sort of systematic, institutional thing, such that if we had the coercive of government involved, it could improve things. And that's what market failure is. And I don't believe that there's any market failure. And now let's just choose public goods, not externalities or what do you call it, monopoly and antitrust. Although I should tell you my antitrust joke, but I'll first do public goods. Okay, what the public goods doctrine is if there's such a thing as excludability and then rivalrousness. And what excludability means is if a non-payer can't be excluded from paying for a thing, then you can't have a private enterprise. And for example, take a crowded street in Mardi Gras in New Orleans. We have Mardi Gras, and on Bourbon Street in Mardi Gras there are just thousands and thousands of people. Or take 42nd Street in New York City on New Year's Eve, where there are millions, maybe hundreds of thousands of people all milling around, and they say you can't exclude non-payers, so therefore streets have to be a public good. And then there's a thing called rivalrousness. Rivalrousness means are people in competition for something. So, for example, is this pen rivalrous? Yes, this pen is rivalrous because if I'm using it, you can't use it. We are rivals for the pen. So that's okay. But then there are things that we're not rivalrous for. For example, take the broadcast that we're now doing. If Joe tunes in, does that mean that Pete can't get the thing? No. they're not rivals for it. They can both tune in on our show, and therefore, even though we could exclude them by having a jamming device and then making them pay for it by giving them an unjamming device, we shouldn't exclude them. This is a market failure because it costs nothing to give the second guy the access to the show, and yet we're charging him for it. So they say that this is a market failure as well. Okay. So I think that's a 2-minute explication of what the public goods argument is. Now let me try to give a critique of it. And the usual examples, see what I did with the pen and the TV, that would be a semi-public good. A pure public good would be something where rivalrousness and excludability impinge, for example, national defense or the lighthouse. Those are the two usual examples given. And I've written 3 or 4 articles on the lighthouse and also on national defense, so if people want to tune in on this, just email me and I'll send you this stuff. The problem with excludability is just because the government can't exclude doesn't mean private enterprise couldn't exclude. All we have to do, look, I do half marathons, and sometimes there are 30 people. In New York City just had a full marathon, and there were maybe 50,000 people in there. How do they exclude non-payers? What they do is they give them all a little bib that they put on, like here's a card, and they put it on their chest, and you have to pay for that. And if you don't have one, the cop will get you for theft of services. So all we have to do is private enterprise excludes very well. Disney World excludes people. They have fences, or even on the city streets. You don't have that bib, you're out. The problem with rivalrousness is, look, there's always a lack of rivalrousness. Namely, you can make a reductio ad absurdum of it. Look, unless a hotel has 100% occupancy, which is very rare, even during Mardi Gras, well, maybe Mardi Gras they have 100% hotel, but most, if you have 70 or 80% hotel occupancy or a movie theater occupancy, that's pretty good. And yet there's lack of rivalrousness there because there are empty seats. And the empty seats cost nobody anything, and yet they're charging for it. So according to the logic of this, anything, unless you have 100% occupancy, should be government run. Namely, this is a recipe for total socialism. Now let's take the lighthouse. Ronald Coase, one of my bitter enemies in economics, although he's a nice guy personally, but I think he's fallacious on many grounds, he wrote about the lighthouse, and what he said was, he really said that the lighthouse was not a good example, but he screwed this all up. And and again, I've written about this, so if people are interested, I can only spend 5 minutes on this, but I've written a lot about it, so we can go in greater depth that way. And here's the deal, the deal that most people use with the lighthouse, and they say, look, you can't have a private lighthouse because the lighthouse guy can't exclude anyone from a non-payer, because if he puts the light on, everyone will see it. And on the other hand, it's not rivalrous because if one boat sees the light, it doesn't detract from another boat seeing the light. So therefore, lighthouses have to be government operated. Now, nowadays we have GPSs and all sorts of mechanisms, so you don't really, that's not a good example modern, but the Austrian view is that public goods never work, whatever the technology is. So it's important to show that even in an earlier day that this was nonsense. And my analysis of this is, look, I'm a private lighthouse owner, and you guys all own boats. And two of you, let's say Dwayne and Chris, pay me, and you're my clients, and Jeff and Blaine don't pay me, and you're free riders. They hate free riding. I have a credible threat. I can say, look, this is during the age of sailing ships. I can say, look, on most nights, I'm not going to be able to see anything. So you'll be able to free ride. But every once in a while, there's going to be sort of a break in the clouds, and I'll be able to see which boats are out there because I can tell, by the cut of the jib or the shape of the sails who's who. And most of those nights, they're going to be clients of mine and non-clients, but maybe once in a blue moon, once or twice a year, I'm going to be able to see through the clouds at night because the moon is up, and there'll only be free riders. And guess what I'm going to do? you dirty rats, I'm going to turn off the lighthouse. And then you're going to crash on the rocks. And this is a credible threat. And you guys are going to have to pay your sailors more than my clients, because my clients will say, look, you come sail with me, and Block won't turn off the lighthouse. But you go work with my competitor who won't pay Block, you're going to have to pay double or triple, because you could die on a shipwreck on those rocks. So this is a way of internalizing the externality, so to speak, or of showing the fallacy of the public goods argument. Namely, even in this case, even in one of the best cases for public goods being a market failure, even here we have a way of defending the marketplace against the public goods argument.
All right. I think we have time for one more good question. Jeff, I gave you two, so Blaine, do you have one more question, or has he answered them? Okay, go. You get the final big question, then I've got some small closers.
Excellent. All right. So, Dr. Block, I was hoping that you could contrast one more thing for me. That is the Austrian approach to utility versus the neoclassical approach to utility.
Sure. We believe in ordinal utility. The bad guys, believe in ordinal and cardinal utility. We think that cardinal utility is nonsense on a stick or nonsense on stilts, and they think that cardinal utility is fine. Oh, so first let me say what is the difference between ordinal and cardinal. Okay, so here's a deck of cards, and here's my wristwatch, and here's a pen. Ordinal utility is I prefer the wristwatch to the deck of cards, and I prefer the deck of cards to my pen, and that's ordering. And this is legitimate. If offered a choice between the wristwatch and the pen, I'll pick the wristwatch. If offered a choice between the deck of cards and the pen, I'll pick the deck of cards. That's ordinal, and that's perfectly legitimate. Cardinal means counting. Namely, there are 20 utils in the wristwatch, there are 10 utils in the deck of cards, and there are 5 utils in the pen. And therefore, this is twice as valuable as this to me, and this is 4 times as valuable to this as me, and this is twice as valuable as the wristwatch is twice as... This is nonsense. This is crazy. There are no utils. There are no units of happiness. And here's where Brian Kaplan goes astray. He's a mainstreamer, and he thinks a cardinal is reasonable. Right. This is crazy.
Now, doesn't he say, and I don't mean to cut you in, but doesn't he say that when he's putting the util, like the utils, so to speak, that he's saying that that is ordinal anymore in his article?
Yeah, of course he says that, but he's wrong. Ordinal means there are no utils. There are no units of happiness. There are no 5 happies and 25 happies, and you're happy. Look, you're laughing. You're 25 units happy. I'm not laughing, so I'm only 5 units happy. So you're 5 times happier than me. That's just lunatic. That's crazy. And not only that, but then they have interpersonal comparison utility. They say, look, Bill Gates gets utils out of all of his money, but it's diminishing margin utility. So for the last dollar he's got, he hardly gets any utils out of it. Whereas I'm poor relative to Bill Gates, and the last dollar I get, I value much more. And therefore, if he gave me some of his money, or if at a point of a gun he was forced to give me some money, he would lose fewer utils than I would gain. And therefore, if we want to maximize wealth in terms of psychic wealth, what we should do is go with a gun against Bill Gates and make him give me $100, or a poor person $100. This is crazy. There's no interpersonal comparison utility, and there's no utils and no happiness units, and this is just interpersonal comparison utility are wrong, and intrapersonal utility calculations are wrong because there are no units of happiness. Now, they have this thing called happiness studies, and what they'll do is they'll give everyone a survey of, well, how happy are you, and they'll give you stupid psychological questions like, at a party, are you happy, or if your girlfriend breaks up with you, how miserable are you, things like that. And then they come up with happiness units, which is just based on answers to stupid questions. This is not science. This is not economics. This is not rational. This is just a perversion of economics.
All right. So I think I just got two quick closing questions then because we're starting to run out of time. The first one, this is very easy. You mentioned the name earlier, but I've always had trouble with it, so I want to hear it real clearly. How the hell do you pronounce Eugene Baum von Bauwerk?
Bombewerk.
Bombewerk. Okay, I've only ever
That's
seen it written before you said it tonight.
That's the German, but I'm not German, so what do I know?
I'm
Another
taking your word for it.
Another one that's hard is I call him Hans Hoppe, a friend of mine. He calls himself Hoppe, but I can't say it, so I call it Hoppe.
I've always taken that for granted that it was Hoppy because I have heard enough people say it, but maybe I'm too trusting and I should just go to the source. At least
he says it is something like Hoppe. But
Hans is still alive though, so we can ask him. We have to trust people for Bavurk, right? Yeah.
Bombewerk is the way I was told it, but what do I know? I'm not a German speaker, so I'm probably mispronouncing it.
Well, maybe we should ask Hoppy how to pronounce that. Yeah.
That'd be a good idea.
Okay, the very last question, as always, and I think we're rounding out the show really well tonight. We almost ran over last show. But the very last question I ask every one of my guests for a book recommendation. I told you before the show, For a New Liberty was already recommended by Dan Sanchez, and Gavin recommended Economics in One Lesson. So we need another book recommendation from you, Dr. Block.
Well, how about Man, Economy, and State? That's a magnificent book.
Man, Economy, and State. That finally goes on the list. Jeff was ready for that. You surprised us with that because I know we talked about some other titles beforehand, but I'm glad that came up. I do like that book. All right, so before we sign off tonight, I want to talk about some other shows that are coming up not at We the Individuals, but at Liberty.me. On November 15, Jeff Tucker is going to be talking in Liberty Classics about the denationalization of money based on F.A. Hayek's book with the same title. That is going to be November 15th again at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. That sounds very, very interesting. It's going to talk about the benefits of just letting people choose their own money, which Dr. Block was mentioning, I think, early in the show. And tomorrow at 8 p.m. Eastern, The Future of Freedom with Scott Horton is going to be interviewing the president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, Jacob Hornberger. So if you're familiar with these individuals, that should be a very interesting interview. Everybody would do very well to tune into these shows. They're well worth your time. Until then, we will be back next week with another episode of We the Individuals Live. Jeff, what are we doing next week?
We actually have Jeffrey Tucker on next week, as a matter of fact.
We have Jeffrey Tucker on next week, so everybody is, of course, going to want to tune in them next Wednesday at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Dr. Block, thank you again so much for coming on the show. This has been very enlightening, particularly for me. I know you've helped me out with a lot of issues I've struggled with, especially the name Eugene Bombewerk. So I think that's it for the show. Good night.
Have a good night. Thanks for having me on your show.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, Dwayne, you're taking us off.
You guys will send me the URL for this, right?
Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah, we can give that to you now. I didn't get the full spelling of your email address, but Dwayne, you can take us off live if you haven't already.
Well, Jeff has it. He and I have been communicating.
Okay, perfect. Okay.
Great.
Walter, one thing I actually was going to offer you is, this is off topic because we're discussing.
By the way, let me cut in. We're still live. I don't know. Dwayne, are you with us?
Daniel.